Hi, I'm Robert Williamson Jr. I'm professor of religious studies at Hendrix College and the co-host of the Bible Worm podcast. I'm also the author of this book, The Forgotten Books of the Bible, Recovering the Five Scrolls for Today. This lecture is the second part of a two-part series on the Song of Songs. So if you have not seen the first part of this lecture series, I would suggest you go back and look at that. These lectures are free for you to use for your own personal use or for your class or your book group. However you find these useful, please feel free. So last time with Song of Songs, we were talking a little bit about the kind of the celebration, really, of human sexuality. These two young lovers who are kind of flirting with each other and um, capturing their kind of passion in these erotically charged but not explicit poems. And we talked about invitation and mutuality and consent and things like that. It's a really beautiful, beautiful text, the Song of Songs. But Song of Songs also has its kind of troubling side. And the most famous passage in that regard is chapter 5. It's not entirely clear, honestly, what's happening in chapter 5. Um, but the female character is in bed, and she says, I'm asleep, but my heart is awake. And nobody has really settled what that means. Some people think that it means that this whole scene is a dream. I myself tend to think that what it means is that she's sleeping, but she's kind of still, like she's in that phase of sleeping where she's not really quite settled yet. And then her lover comes to the door. And so she's in bed, she's on her way to sleep, her lover comes to the door. But I don't take this as a dream sequence, although some people do. So he says, Open to me, my sister, my companion, my dove, my innocent. For my head is covered with the evening mist, my locks with the dew of the night. Now, the image here is it's late at night, she's in bed, he's come to the door, he's, rapping on the door, saying to open. And this, as is the case with a lot of Song of Songs, the word door is not there. So it's open to me, my sister. And so, yes, open the door to me, but also there is this kind of sexual innuendo that's there as well. This kind of invitation in a more erotic sense. So she says, I have stripped off my clothes. How can I dress again? I have bathed my feet. How can I dirty them? Now, I think that she is being coy there. That she's kind of saying, oh, mercy, goodness me, like, how could I possibly get up and open the door for you? But she's doing it in a way that, is invitational in its own way, but this kind of flirtatious, coy rejection. That's how I read it. And there are probably other ways of reading it. Now, he apparently does not hear the flirtation, but rather he disappears. And so the female character says, My lover pulls his hand from the latch hole. My body moans for him. So he has withdrawn, and she sort of feels her, like, her spirit go out of her, right? Like, she feels this, like, longing for him. So she says, I arise to open for my lover. There's again that double entendre. My hands drip myrrh, my fingers liquid myrrh upon the handles of the bolt. There's lots of innuendo there as well. I open for my lover, but my lover has withdrawn, passed on. How my breath escaped me when he spoke. I seek him, but I cannot find him. I call to him, but he does not answer. So here we have this image of this woman who has been stirred from her near slumber by her lover coming to the door. And she has gotten up to open the door for him, kind of excited about his invitation. But by the time she gets to the door, he's nowhere to be found. He's withdrawn. How we are to understand him is not entirely clear. I read him as being, hurt by her words, sort of feeling like he had been rejected and sort of saying, well, fine then, I'll leave you be. My friend Amy, who does the Bible Worm podcast, reads him actually as being very like studious here, or like hearing her no as a no and saying he's done the right thing, like he's gone away instead of trying to press matters. So it's open to some interpretation. But what happens next is that she seems to have wandered out in the street and she's looking for her lover. And she says, "They found me, the guards who make their rounds in the city." So the night watchmen have found her when she's out looking for her lover. And then she says, "They struck me, bruised me, they took my shawl away from me, those guards of the city walls." Now this is obviously a really disturbing image, right? So she is out at night. She's looking for her lover. The night watchmen, the guards who are supposed to protect her, are the ones who attack her. And there is a, it's not entirely clear. Like, she's clearly wounded. They struck me, they bruised me, and she's had her shawl taken away. So there's been some removal of clothing here. So this is clearly an assault. One can read this as a sexual assault, although I think one doesn't necessarily have to read it that way, but it's certainly suggested in the language. But it's the men who are sworn to protect who are here the ones causing the damage. Now this resonates in all kinds of ways with modern life and conversations going on, at least in American culture at this moment and at many moments. One of the arguments about this text is that the watchmen assume that she is a prostitute. She's a sex worker because she's out in the middle of the night looking for her lover. And sometimes that is said as though, like, well, then of course the night watchman beat her, right? Because she's doing something illegal. But like, that's not the way that ought to be read, right? She's a sex worker. If that were their understanding, like, the proper response there is not to beat her and to take her shawl, but to do some other way of intervening. So one of the things that feminist scholars in particular have seen in this little text here is this idea that while the Song of Songs is very much a celebration of human sexuality, and the main character who has the most lines in this text is the female character talking about her own kind of sexual feelings, that this song is still yet dangerous for women. There is a danger to women then. There's a danger to women now. Interestingly, it's by these men whose job is to, in their minds, to control her exercise of her sexuality, it seems like, or to like protect the kind of sexual purity of the culture. There's this sense that these men are, they're trying to restrict her, to protect her honor, to protect their honor, to protect the integrity of the city, to do something. We also saw that from her brothers actually last time in chapter 8, where they say, when our daughter has suitors, we're going to build a turret for her. We're going to close up her doors. And they likewise are saying, we're going to exercise our power to control women's sexuality, when these women are not actually asking for anyone to protect them, or to protect their honor. Now, in the next verse, suddenly there appears the daughters of Jerusalem. There's this like group of friends of hers who show up in the next verse. Apparently she's been telling them this story. But she says to them, "I place you under oath, daughters of Jerusalem. If you find my love, what should you tell him? That I'm weak with love." So she's had this kind of harrowing experience, but the thing that she still wants is for her lover to be with her. Now, the daughters of Jerusalem then reply, "What is your beloved more than any other, O fairest woman? What is your beloved more than any other, that you should give us this charge?" Now, that's a really interesting reply. One of my students at Hendrix, Laura Beth Durham, in a class for a paper for one of my classes, she got really interested in the role of the daughters of Jerusalem in this text. And she was very disturbed, and I think rightly so, by this preceding scene that seems to be an act of sexual violence by the night watchman against this woman, and yet this woman is still seeking her man. And so she read the daughters of Jerusalem as kind of a figure of women's solidarity, that they're showing up for the Shulamite, for the female main character. And they're showing up to support her, but at the same time they're asking her, like, what's this guy about? So the way Laura Beth said is, for women who readers of this text, we can hold on to the bonds of sisterhood between the maidens of Jerusalem and the bride, and support each other in the event of sexual assault. So women need to be present and for each other in this kind of solidarity kind of way. We must lift each other up and be unafraid to point out to each other when the men in our lives are possessive. We must be unafraid to ask, who is your beloved more than any other? So Laura Beth's reading, in a really interesting way, is to say, look, this guy kind of abandoned you in the streets, and you ended up being wounded. So is he worth all of that? And so for the women to be there supporting and being unafraid to kind of ask the question. Now, for the main character in the female character in the text, maybe it is worth it. But the women are there to support what she wants. Now, Laura Beth was reading that for women, we can hold on to women's solidarity. So then the women become the main characters of this text. The men are kind of unreliable figures, and it's a fair reading of Song of Songs. Even the male lover is sometimes present, sometimes absent. The brothers are kind of possessive. The night watchmen end up wounding her. So Laura Beth says we can read kind of against this text, actually, and lift up the women's solidarity as kind of the main point of this text. I think that's a beautiful reading, and the one thing that I would kind of add to her interpretation is that that men and people of all genders can also be present in solidarity with people of whatever gender, but especially in this case of women, but people who are victims of sexual violence, whatever their gender expression. All of us can choose to be in solidarity with them first before we're kind of in league with our male companions. All right. So I mentioned at the very beginning of the last lecture that the Song of Songs has most often been read in the tradition as an allegory of the love of God for humankind. In the Jewish tradition, that's love of God for Israel. In the Christian tradition, often love of God for the church, or love of Christ for the church, sometimes the love of God for the individual. Now, the traditional reading is that God is the male character in the Song of Songs, and humankind, in one form or another, is the female character. You can kind of see, having read the erotic love poetry of the Song of Songs that made it into the biblical canon, you can kind of see why people kind of tended to read it allegorically, because otherwise you just have this text that's lifting up, body positivity and the joy of human sexuality, and like, how are you going to let that be in the Bible, right? I mean, I think we should let that be in the Bible, and I'm glad it's there, but the traditional reading sort of avoided that issue by saying, oh, no, this is really about God's love for Israel. So there's a few things that are really beautiful if you read it this way. God is the male character, Israel is the female character. So if you read it that way, if you go back to this poem that we read in chapter 2, then we find humankind, us, saying, like an apple tree among the wild trees, so is my lover. That is, so is God among the other gods, right? God is the one. Like, God is an apple tree among the brambles. I take rest in God's shade. I taste God's fruit. He brings me into the house of wine. His banner over me is love. So that banner over me is love. God has staked a claim, like in the way somebody plants a flag on a new territory. That's the image of the banner, is God has claimed humankind with a banner that says, they are mine and I love them. It's a beautiful, beautiful idea. And if you come back to verse 6, which I talked about last time, his, in this case now, is God. God's left arm is beneath my head. God's right embraces me. And if you just think about the intimacy of that, like the creator of the universe is like snuggled up with us, like spooning there, like holding us close. Just the tenderness of that image, and the passion of that image of God, a God who loves us not distantly, not reservedly, but intimately and closely. Like you can feel God breathing, on your neck. It's a really beautiful, beautiful idea. I also love this line in chapter 8. It's a beautiful verse anyway, if you read it just as between two human lovers. But if you read it as between human being and God, so this is again the female voice, so it's us saying to God, "Set me as a seal over your heart, as a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death, passionate love, unrelenting as the grave." If you read it as an allegory, then this is humankind saying to God, like, write our names on your arm. Write our names on your heart, so close to the divine self that you can't forget. So that when we die, we can trust that your love for us is as strong as death, as unrelenting as the grave. That is, we will rest in your care when we have died, and you won't forget us. Um, that's a really beautiful idea in the allegorical reading. But the allegorical reading also produces problems. And the big problem is the one we saw just a little bit ago in chapter 5, which is also here again in chapter 3, where the female character says, "I looked for my lover with all my heart. I looked, but I couldn't find him. I will rise and go all around the city." Here in chapter 3, she doesn't get beaten, but in chapter 5, she does. And so if you read this as an allegory, then what you end up with is a God who is a little bit fickle, sometimes present, sometimes absent. And human beings who go out looking for God sometimes are wounded in their search. That's a troubling way of reading the allegory. Now, what the ancient rabbis did with that is they said, look, this image in chapter 5 is about the exile when Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed Jerusalem and took the people away into exile in Babylon for 50 years. That's what's being described. God abandoned the people. They were wounded by the Babylonians. God came and restored them. So the ancient Jewish tradition says that, yeah, there is something true about that. Sometimes God abandons people and then comes back and redeems them later. So it's an uncomfortable reading, but not an entirely unreasonable one. That said, my good friend Marie Maynard O'Connell, the Reverend Marie Maynard O'Connell here in Arkansas, suggested to me one day that my problem with the allegorical reading was I had the poles of the allegory backwards. And she said, if you just flip the allegory so that God is the female character and Israel, humankind, the church, is the male character, you get a really different reading. And I started playing around with that, and I just barely have played around with it in my book. But it really is kind of remarkably transformative. And it's an allegory, so it's just like you might as well reverse the poles, right? Like we're kind of making connections that aren't in the text anyway, so let's just make the connections differently. If you read it that way, then human beings are the male character. We're the ones who are kind of flighty. We're the ones who are kind of fickle. We're the ones who come to the door and then leave before, the door is opened. We're the ones who wander off over the hills. We're the ones who are not entirely trustworthy. God, then, the female character, is the one who is present, the one who is home, the one who is waiting for us, the one in this text and in the text in chapter 5, the one who is willing to come out looking for us. In chapter 5, the one who is willing to be, beaten on our behalf in this really kind of interesting way. And there's a Christological way of reading that too, to say God came to find us and was beaten and killed by the Romans. Like one can kind of find the Jesus narrative in there. You don't have to, but it's a way of kind of getting there. So I love this idea of reversing the allegory. If you keep that idea in mind, then a verse like this, so if you first read it in the traditional allegory, this verse is spoken by humankind to God. I belong to my lover, and my lover belongs to me. So this is a confession of faith. I belong to God, God belongs to me. It's beautiful. But if you reverse the allegory, and so now this is spoken by God, it's God saying, I belong to you, and you belong to me. That's not a confession of faith. Like that is a promise you can put in the bank, right? Like God has said to us, you're mine and I belong to you. And the kind of strength of that claim is really profound. If you come back to this passage we were looking at just a little bit ago, now God is saying to us, hey, you set me as a seal on your heart, as a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death, passionate love is unrelenting as the grave. So where in the traditional allegory this was spoken by humankind as kind of a hope, like let us hope that God remembers us. Now, if God speaks these words, it is a promise. Yes, you can sign it on your heart that my love is as strong as death. There's not a there's not a hope here. There's a promise here, and it is a really, really beautiful one. Now, one of the questions then that people ask about the Song of Songs is how should we read it, right? I've given us straightforward erotic love poetry. I've given us traditional allegory in which God is the male and humankind is the female. And then following Marie Maynard O'Connell, I've suggested the reverse allegory. God is the female and humankind is the male. And one question you might ask is like, well, which is the right way to read it? My answer to that question is yes, right? Like these three ways of reading the book all open up such fascinating conversations. The first way opens up a conversation about human sexuality, about mutuality, about consent, about the admiration and acceptance of bodies, the beauty of the human form. Like that is a conversation we need to have. The traditional allegorical reading has these lovely, lovely images of a God who welcomes us, who holds us, who spoons us, who wants to be with us, who loves us passionately, not just kind of in this like technical sense, but like in a passionate way, and really beautifully. And then the reverse allegory opens up this possibility of God who makes promises, of God who is infinitely reliable, of we who are the ones who tend to fade away. So all three ways of talking about this text, and there might be other ones that you think of, they open up conversations. They open up possibilities about our relationships with God, about our relationships with each other, and they create this fertile ground for conversation where we can talk to each other and wrestle with all these different ideas. So I hope you enjoy the Song of Songs as much as I do. It's a little bit of an awkward text to talk about, especially when you first start, but if you can stick with it for a little bit, some really beautiful things can open up. If you're looking for me, you can find me at my website at robertwilliamsonjr.com. I'm on Facebook at robertwilliamsonjr.author, Twitter at rwilliamsonjr. If you have not listened to the Bible Worm podcast, please do go. We're doing episodes on all of these books throughout this summer, so BibleWormPodcast.com. If you want to get in touch, you can find me at robertwilliamsonjr.com. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you next time.